A 5-year-old little girl stood in the middle of a busy city sidewalk with her arms spread wide, trying to shield her mother from a man 4 times her size. Her tiny voice trembled as she shouted, "Don't touch my mom!" And just a few feet away, a sleek black luxury car waited at the curb. Beneath its seat was a bomb powerful enough to turn that street into fire and smoke. But the powerful man walking toward that car didn't know any of this. To him, the poor woman grabbing his sleeve was just another street vendor, someone invisible. What he didn't know was that this invisible single mother had just overheard a deadly secret, spoken in a language no one thought she could understand. And in the next 13 minutes, a poor flower seller and her 5-year-old daughter would change the fate of the richest man in the city forever. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe if stories about courage, family, and second chances mean something to you. Every day at exactly 3 in the afternoon, Belle Lawson stood on the same street corner in front of the Mercer Grand Hotel. If you ever walked past that corner, you probably wouldn't remember her. Most people didn't. She was 27 years old, her brown hair tied back in a quick knot, her faded shirt worn thin from years of washing. In her hands she carried a small basket filled with fresh roses. $3 a stem, she would say gently to people passing by. Most of them didn't stop. The Mercer Grand was one of the most expensive hotels in the city. Wealthy travelers stepped out through its golden revolving doors wearing designer suits and silk dresses. Luxury cars waited along the curb. Drivers in polished shoes opened doors with quiet precision. And right there on the edge of that shining world stood Belle, a poor single mother selling flowers. Beside her was Willa, 5 years old. Blonde hair always a little messy. Bright blue eyes that carried more curiosity than the world had been kind enough to deserve. While Belle offered roses to strangers, Willa liked to sit on the sidewalk beside the basket, picking up fallen petals and pressing them flat against the pavement like tiny pieces of art. Sometimes she waved at people walking by. Most of them didn't wave back. But Willa didn't seem to notice. Children that young still believed the world was kind. Belle watched her daughter often when no one was looking. There was a quiet pride in her eyes, mixed with a kind of sadness only mothers understood. Life hadn't been easy. Years ago, Belle had been a medical student with dreams bigger than the city skyline. But those dreams ended when she fell in love with a man from a wealthy family. At first he had been charming. Later, he became something else. After the divorce, Belle was left alone, pregnant, and with nothing except the tiny life growing inside her. Then came the worst blow. Her mother, Dorothy, the one person who had always believed in her, died of cancer the same month Willa was born. One life entered the world. Another left it. And Belle had been standing in the middle of both. Now it was just the two of them, surviving day by day. Selling roses meant dinner tonight. But it didn't mean rent next month. Still, Belle rarely complained. She had learned something important about being poor in a city filled with wealth. When people think you are invisible, they stop watching what they say. They speak freely. They talk about secrets. And that quiet truth was about to change everything. Because on one ordinary Tuesday evening, at exactly 5:47 p.m., Belle heard something that made the blood in her veins turn cold. It happened just outside the Mercer Grand entrance. 3 men wearing hotel security uniforms stood near the curb, smoking and laughing together. One of them was Jericho Voss, the head of hotel security. Belle recognized him immediately. Anyone who worked the corner long enough knew the important faces. But what caught her attention wasn't the men. It was the language they were speaking. Italian. And the moment Belle heard the words, her heart stopped. Because Italian had been the language of her childhood. Her mother Dorothy had spoken it every day. Cooking pasta in the kitchen, singing old lullabies, telling stories beside the stove. Belle understood every word. And what those men were saying wasn't casual conversation. It was a murder plan. Jericho flicked his cigarette to the ground and said something that made the other two men laugh. When he opens the car door, boom. One of the guards made a small exploding gesture with his hands. Belle slowly turned her head toward the black luxury car parked at the curb. She had seen that car every day for 4 months. At exactly 6 o'clock each evening, the owner of the Mercer Grand stepped into it and left the hotel. His name was Kieran Ashford, 36 years old, self-made millionaire, one of the most powerful men in the city, a man who walked through life like the world belonged to him. Belle had seen him twice. He had never once looked at her. To him, she didn't exist. But now Belle knew something he didn't. There was a bomb in that car. She looked up at the large clock mounted above the hotel entrance. 5:47 p.m. 13 minutes. 13 minutes before the man who had never noticed her would walk out of that building, step into that car, and disappear in a blast of fire. Belle looked down at Willa. "Mommy?" the little girl asked softly. Belle felt her heart pounding like a drum. She was just a poor flower seller. No one would believe her. No one ever listened to people like her. But somewhere deep in her memory, she heard her mother's voice again. Silence in the face of wrong is the same as helping the wrong. Belle tightened her grip on the basket of roses. And for the first time that day, fear met courage inside her chest. Because in 13 minutes, she was about to do something that would change all their lives. And the first person she needed to convince was the driver standing beside that black car. Belle walked toward the black car with Willa balanced on her hip and the basket of roses hanging from her arm. Her steps were quick, but her legs felt strangely weak, as if the ground beneath her shoes had suddenly turned soft. The driver stood beside the vehicle with quiet patience, his posture straight, his dark suit crisp and unwrinkled. Belle had seen him almost every evening. The hotel staff called him Porter. He was a man who lived by routine, by schedules, by silence. Belle stopped a few feet from him, her heart hammering. "Excuse me," she said, her voice breathless. "Sir, I need to tell you something important." Porter lifted his eyes slowly. His gaze moved from Belle's anxious face to the basket of roses in her hand, then to the small child clinging to her shoulder. He recognized her immediately. The flower seller. He had seen her every day for months. "What is it?" he asked politely, though the tone in his voice suggested he was already expecting something small and forgettable. Belle swallowed hard. "This car," she said quietly. "Something is wrong with this car." Porter's brow creased slightly, but not with concern. It was the expression of a man trying to understand why a stranger had interrupted his routine. "What do you mean?" Belle leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I heard your security guards talking just now," she whispered. "They were speaking Italian. They said there's a device under the seat. They're planning to detonate it when Mr. Ashford opens the door." For a moment Porter said nothing. Then his eyes softened in a way Belle knew too well. It was the same look people gave when they believed someone was confused or imagining things. "You sell flowers here every day, right?" he asked calmly. "Yes, but please listen to me," Belle insisted. "They talked about a bomb. They said when he opens the car door." "Ma'am," Porter interrupted gently, lifting a hand. "Mr. Ashford will be coming down shortly. I need to prepare the vehicle." Belle felt frustration rise in her chest. "This isn't about flowers," she said quickly. "Someone is trying to kill him." Porter had already turned his attention to his phone. The conversation, in his mind, was finished. Not because he was cruel. Simply because people like Belle rarely carried information important enough to disrupt the schedule of a man like Kieran Ashford. Beside her, Willa shifted in her mother's arms and held out a small rose. "Hi, mister," she said brightly. Porter glanced up again. His expression softened instantly. "Well, hello there," he said with a small smile. He accepted the rose from her tiny hand for a moment before handing it back. "Thank you, sweetheart." Then he returned to his phone. Belle stood frozen. The warning she had carried across the street with so much courage had fallen like a feather against a wall of stone. No one had listened. She stepped back slowly, her heart sinking. Across the street the 3 security men had already dispersed, blending into the evening crowd. No one would believe her now. Belle looked up toward the tall glass tower of the Mercer Grand. Somewhere near the top floor, Kieran Ashford was finishing his workday, completely unaware that death was waiting for him in the seat of his own car. She had seen him only twice in 4 months. Once he had walked past her without even a glance. Another time Willa had waved. He hadn't noticed. It wasn't cruelty. It was something colder. The simple truth that powerful people rarely saw those living at the edges of their world. Belle glanced at the large clock above the hotel entrance. 5:49 p.m. 11 minutes. Her pulse quickened. She looked down at Willa. The little girl's blue eyes were watching her closely. "Mommy, what's wrong?" Belle forced a small smile. "Nothing, sweetheart." But the lie sat heavy in her throat. If Porter wouldn't listen, who would? A terrible thought whispered through her mind. Maybe no one. Maybe she had done everything she could. She could pick up her basket, take Willa home, cook the small plate of pasta waiting in their cupboard, and pretend none of this had happened. After all, she was nobody. Just a poor woman selling flowers. And powerful men had powerful problems. But then another voice rose quietly in her memory. Her mother's voice. Belle could almost hear Dorothy speaking Italian in the warm kitchen of their old home. Silence in the face of wrong is the same as helping the wrong. Belle closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, the answer was clear. If no one outside would listen, then she would go inside. She adjusted Willa on her hip, lifted the basket of roses, and walked toward the gleaming golden doors of the Mercer Grand. The revolving doors spun slowly as wealthy guests moved in and out. Belle stepped forward and pushed through. The lobby opened before her like another world. The marble floor shone beneath crystal chandeliers. The air smelled faintly of lilies and polished wood. Soft music drifted from hidden speakers. Belle suddenly became aware of her worn shoes, her faded shirt, her tangled hair, and the small child in her arms wearing a dress that had been washed so many times the fabric had turned pale. They didn't belong here. Not even a little. She had barely taken 5 steps when a large security guard moved directly into her path. His uniform was spotless. His expression firm. "This area isn't for vendors," he said flatly. "You'll have to leave." "I'm not selling flowers," Belle said quickly. "I need to speak to Mr. Ashford. Someone is trying to hurt him." The guard's face didn't change. "Mr. Ashford doesn't meet with anyone without an appointment." "You don't understand," Belle insisted, her voice rising slightly. "There's a bomb in his car." The guard sighed. Then his hand settled firmly on her shoulder. "Ma'am," he said, turning her gently but firmly toward the door. "Please leave." Belle twisted around desperately. "Please." They were speaking Italian. They said, but the revolving door pushed them back outside. Late afternoon sunlight flooded her eyes. Street noise rushed into her ears. And suddenly Willa began to cry. Not the small whining cry of a tired child. This was fear. The little girl buried her face against Belle's neck and trembled. Belle knelt down immediately, wrapping her arms around her daughter. "It's okay," she whispered softly. "I'm right here." But as she lifted her eyes toward the hotel entrance again, the clock above the doors read 5:51 p.m. 9 minutes left. And Belle realized something terrifying. She had tried twice. No one had listened. And now, she had almost run out of time. Belle stayed on her knees on the sidewalk, holding Willa close while the little girl's small shoulders trembled against her chest. The basket of roses had tipped over beside them. A few stems rolled slowly toward the curb, their red petals brushing the concrete. Belle didn't notice. All she could hear was the uneven rhythm of her daughter's breathing. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered softly, brushing her fingers through Willa's tangled hair. "Mommy's right here." Willa clung to her neck tighter. "Mom, that man pushed you." Belle closed her eyes for a moment. Children understood things adults often missed. Willa didn't know about bombs or betrayal or the danger sitting quietly inside that black car. But she understood that someone had shoved her mother aside, and that no one had helped. Belle forced herself to smile, though her throat burned. "It's all right," she said gently. "Sometimes grown-ups just don't listen." Willa pulled back a little and looked at her. The little girl's blue eyes were wet, but she nodded as if trying very hard to be brave. Belle wiped the tears from Willa's cheeks with her thumb. Then she slowly looked up at the hotel entrance again. The golden revolving doors turned quietly as wealthy guests came and went. For them, the evening was normal. Dinner reservations. Business meetings. Expensive wine waiting somewhere upstairs. No one on that sidewalk knew that death might be sitting quietly under the seat of a car just a few feet away. Belle lifted her eyes to the clock again. 5:52 p.m. 8 minutes. Her stomach tightened. She sat back against the stone planter beside the hotel entrance and pulled Willa into her lap. The little girl curled against her like a frightened kitten. Around them, the city kept moving. People hurried past with shopping bags and briefcases. Taxi horns echoed in the distance. Laughter drifted from a nearby cafe. No one stopped. No one noticed the poor woman sitting on the sidewalk with her child. And inside Belle's mind, a quiet voice began to whisper. "Go home. You tried. You warned the driver. You tried to tell the guard. They didn't listen." That voice was gentle, almost comforting. It told her she had done enough. She could gather the roses, take Willa back to their small apartment, cook dinner, and pretend this afternoon had never happened. No one knew what she had heard. No one would blame her. If something terrible happened to the rich man walking out of that hotel tonight, it wouldn't be her fault. She was just a flower seller. But then another voice rose from deeper inside her memory. A voice she had not heard in years. Her mother's voice. Dorothy had spoken with a warm Italian accent that always carried the scent of basil and old lullabies. Belle remembered a winter afternoon when she was 14. They had been standing in a grocery store when a man began shouting cruelly at his wife near the checkout line. Everyone around them had looked away. No one said anything. Except Dorothy. Belle could still remember the moment her mother stepped forward, placing herself between the man and his frightened wife. "You do not treat people like that," Dorothy had said firmly. Belle had tugged at her mother's sleeve back then, terrified. "Mom, let's go," she had whispered. But Dorothy had only looked down at her daughter and said something Belle would never forget. Silence in the face of wrong is the same as helping the wrong. The memory settled over Belle now like a quiet hand on her shoulder. She looked down at Willa. The little girl's blonde hair had fallen across her eyes. Her lashes were still wet from crying, but she was trying to be brave. 5 years old. So small. And watching her mother closely. Children learned who they would become by watching what their parents did when life became hard. If Belle stood up and walked away now, what would Willa learn? That fear was stronger than courage. That it was okay to ignore danger when it wasn't your problem. That her mother was someone who gave up when the world pushed back. Belle slowly inhaled. Her hands were still trembling. Her heart still pounded, but something stronger than fear began to rise inside her chest. She gently set Willa on her feet in front of her. "Sweetheart," Belle said softly, taking the little girl's hands, "I need you to listen to Mommy for a moment." Willa looked up at her with wide eyes. "Okay." Belle brushed a strand of hair away from her daughter's face. "I'm about to do something important," she continued. "Some people might get upset. It might feel a little scary." Willa didn't understand everything, but she understood the seriousness in her mother's voice. Belle squeezed her hands gently. "Can you be brave with me?" The little girl straightened her shoulders in a way that almost made Belle smile. "I'm brave," Willa said quietly. Belle pulled her into a quick hug and kissed the top of her head. "I know you are." Then Belle stood. Her legs still felt weak, but she forced them steady. She picked up the basket of roses and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Across the street, she noticed something that made her stomach twist. Jericho Voss stood near a street lamp, pretending to scroll through his phone. Not far from him, another guard leaned casually against a wall. And across the intersection, a third man watched the hotel entrance with quiet patience. They were waiting. 3 wolves circling their prey. Belle lifted her eyes to the clock again. 5:56 p.m. 4 minutes. She turned to Willa and led her to the far side of the stone pillar beside the hotel entrance. "Stay here behind the wall," Belle said gently, kneeling in front of her daughter again. "Don't move until I come get you." Willa clutched one rose tightly in her small hand and nodded. Belle stood and stepped forward. She positioned herself directly in front of the hotel doors. Her heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. The revolving doors began to turn, and a tall man in a charcoal gray suit stepped out onto the sidewalk. Kieran Ashford. He moved with quiet confidence, a phone pressed to his ear as he spoke calmly about numbers and schedules. He didn't look at the sky. He didn't look at the street. He didn't look at the woman standing directly in his path. To him, she was still invisible. Porter had already opened the car door. The black vehicle waited just a few steps away. Belle's chest tightened. If he took 4 more steps, everything would end. She took a breath that felt like jumping off a cliff. And then she called out, "Mr. Ashford, please don't get in that car." Kieran Ashford did not slow down. The phone remained at his ear as he continued speaking in that calm, controlled tone of a man who was used to people listening to him, not the other way around. "Move the meeting to Thursday," he said quietly. "No, that won't be a problem." Belle's voice had barely carried above the noise of the street. He hadn't heard her. Or maybe he had, and simply didn't register that the voice belonged to someone worth noticing. Porter stood beside the open car door, waiting. 7 steps. Belle felt panic rising in her chest. "Mr. Ashford," she called again, louder this time. "Please don't get into that car." A few pedestrians slowed down, glancing over with mild curiosity. But Kieran kept walking. 6 steps. His attention remained on the conversation in his ear. Belle felt the seconds slipping away. 5 steps. If he reached that door, it would be over. Her mind stopped thinking. Fear, doubt, embarrassment, everything vanished in a single desperate instinct. She ran. The basket of roses swung wildly in her hand as she rushed toward him. 2 steps away, she reached out and grabbed the sleeve of his suit jacket. Kieran stopped. Not because he had finally heard her. Because something had physically interrupted his movement. The phone lowered slowly from his ear. He looked down first at the hand gripping his sleeve. The hand was small, roughened from work. A thin scratch crossed the knuckle, one of many little marks left by rose thorns. Then his gaze lifted to the woman standing in front of him. For the first time in 4 months. Kieran Ashford actually looked at Belle Lawson. His eyes were cold. Not cruel. Just distant. Like someone examining an unexpected interruption. "Let go," he said quietly. The words were soft, but they carried the kind of authority that made people obey without thinking. Belle's hand trembled against the fabric of his sleeve. But she didn't release it. "There's a bomb in the car," she said. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. Kieran studied her face for a brief moment. Then he glanced toward Porter standing by the open door. His expression remained calm. Almost bored. He turned slightly as if preparing to continue walking. In his mind, the situation was simple. A street vendor had grabbed him and said something irrational. Probably hoping for attention. Or money. "Security," he said. The word was quiet. But it carried enough weight to make a nearby guard step forward immediately. Belle saw the man approaching and felt the blood drain from her face. It was Crane. The same man she had seen earlier laughing beside Jericho when they discussed the bomb. The same man who had casually spoken the words "remote detonation" as if he were talking about lunch. Crane walked toward her with an expressionless face. His hand reached out. If he touched her, she would be dragged away again. And Kieran Ashford would step into that car. 3 seconds. Maybe less. Belle realized in that instant that there was only one thing left she could do. Something no one on that sidewalk would expect. She opened her mouth. And spoke in Italian. The words came out fast, sharp, precise. "Bomba sotto il sedile posterior. Detonazione a distanza alle 6. Bomb under the rear seat. Remote detonation at 6. The language flowed from her mouth the way her mother had spoken it all those years ago in their kitchen. Kieran froze. His foot stopped halfway through the next step. He didn't speak Italian. But he understood enough to recognize 2 words instantly. Bomba. Detonazione. His head turned slowly back toward her. Crane stopped as well. Just for a fraction of a second. Because something had changed. The woman standing in front of them was no longer speaking nonsense. She was describing something far too specific to ignore. Kieran's eyes narrowed slightly. "Where did you hear that?" he asked quietly. His voice was different now. Still calm. But the calm had sharpened. Belle forced herself to hold his gaze. "Your security team," she said. "Jericho Voss, Crane, and the 3rd guard across the street." She swallowed hard. They were talking outside the hotel at 5:47. They thought no one would understand them. Crane's hand hung in the air beside her shoulder. Close. But no longer touching. Belle didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Kieran. "My mother was Italian," she said softly. "I understood everything." The street seemed to grow strangely quiet. Kieran studied her face with an intensity that made Belle's heartbeat stumble. For the first time, he wasn't looking through her. He was looking at her. Truly seeing her. And in that moment, Belle realized something terrifying. Crane was still standing beside her. Too close. His expression had changed. The blank politeness was gone. In its place was a cold calculation. If he grabbed her now, if he dragged her away before Kieran fully processed what she had said, the plan could still succeed. Crane's fingers moved again toward her shoulder. Belle braced herself. But before his hand could reach her, a small blur shot forward from behind the stone pillar. Tiny shoes slapped against the pavement. Willa. The little girl had tried to stay where her mother told her. She had tried to be brave. But she had seen the large man reaching toward Belle. And in the simple world of a 5-year-old, that meant danger. She ran straight toward them. Before anyone could react, Willa planted herself directly between Crane and her mother. Her back pressed against Belle's legs. her small arms stretched out wide like fragile wings. "Don't touch my mom," she shouted. Her voice trembled, but it was loud enough to stop everyone on that sidewalk. Pedestrians turned. Porter looked up sharply, and Kieran Ashford lowered his gaze. Standing in front of him was a tiny girl with tangled blonde hair and tearful blue eyes. She was barely tall enough to reach Crane's knee. Her arms shook as she held them out, protecting the woman behind her. The rose in her hand trembled with her movement. But she didn't move, didn't step back, didn't run. She stood there like a small shield between her mother and the world. And something inside Kieran Ashford cracked. Not loudly, not visibly, just a thin fracture along the invisible wall he had built around himself for 36 years. Because when he looked at that child, he saw something he recognized. A small boy standing alone in a world too large for him. A boy who had never had someone stand in front of him with arms spread wide. No one touches them. Kieran's voice cut through the air like a blade. Crane froze. Slowly, very slowly. Kieran turned his head toward the black car waiting beside the curb. The street seemed to hold its breath. Kieran Ashford's eyes stayed on the small girl standing between her mother and the man reaching for her. Willa's arms were still stretched wide, though they trembled with the effort. Her tiny fingers gripped the rose so tightly that one of the petals had already fallen onto the pavement. "Don't touch my mom," she repeated, her voice softer now but still stubborn. Crane didn't move. Not because he suddenly cared about a frightened child. Because of the voice behind him. Kieran's voice. No one touches them. The words weren't loud, but the quiet authority in them froze everyone within 10 feet. Crane slowly lowered his hand. For a moment he looked as though he might say something, but he didn't. Because the look in Kieran's eyes had changed. It was no longer the distant, controlled calm people were used to seeing. There was something sharper there now. Something dangerous. Kieran turned his head slightly toward Porter. "Step away from the car," he said. Porter blinked, confused. "Sir." "Now." Porter had worked long enough for Kieran Ashford to recognize when that tone meant questions were not welcome. He immediately released the door handle and stepped back 2 paces. The open door of the car swung slightly before settling still again. Belle felt her breath catch in her chest. This was the moment. Either Kieran believed her, or everything fell apart. Kieran's gaze moved slowly across the street. Jericho Voss was no longer pretending to look at his phone. He was watching. The distance between them was only about 20 yards, but the meaning behind that look carried much further. Kieran looked back at Belle. "Repeat exactly what you heard," he said. His voice remained quiet, but now it carried something different. "Focus." Belle nodded quickly, her heart pounding. "They said there was a device under the seat," she said. "Remote detonation at 6 o'clock when you open the door." Her eyes flicked briefly toward Crane before returning to Kieran. They were speaking Italian because they thought no one would understand. Kieran's jaw tightened slightly. The detail had been too precise, too specific, and he knew something else. Jericho had been in charge of security for years. If Jericho wanted access to his car, no one would question it. Kieran slowly reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. He dialed a number. When the call connected, his voice was calm. "Beckett." There was a brief pause as the voice on the other end responded. "Code Red," Kieran said quietly. "Lock down the building. Bring my team to the front entrance immediately." His gaze drifted once more across the street. Jericho had stopped pretending entirely now. He was staring directly back. Kieran continued speaking into the phone. And Beckett, not Jericho's men. He ended the call. The silence that followed felt heavy. Willa was still standing in front of her mother, though Belle gently rested a hand on the little girl's shoulder. "You did good, sweetheart," Belle whispered softly. The words were meant to calm her daughter, but they also steadied Belle herself. Kieran glanced down briefly at the child. Her small shoulders were still shaking, but she hadn't stepped aside. Not once. Then he looked back toward Jericho. Something shifted in the air. Jericho suddenly turned and began walking quickly down the street. That single movement said everything. Crane took a small step back. But it was already too late. The hotel's revolving doors burst open behind Kieran. 6 men in dark suits moved out quickly and spread across the sidewalk with practiced precision. Their leader was Beckett. Tall, solidly built, his sharp eyes took in the entire scene in a single glance. His gaze moved from Kieran to the open car door, to Crane standing beside Belle. Then he noticed Jericho moving away across the street. "Stop him," Beckett said calmly. 2 men broke off immediately. Jericho started running. For a moment the street erupted into chaos. Pedestrians scattered. Car horns blared. Jericho barely made it 6 steps before the first man tackled him hard to the pavement. The second guard pinned his arms behind his back. Something metallic clattered across the sidewalk. A handgun. The backup plan. Across the street, the third guard, Duff, had frozen where he stood. 2 more of Beckett's men were already closing in on him. Crane tried to slip into the crowd. He didn't get far. Beckett stepped directly into his path. "Don't," Beckett said quietly. Crane stopped. Within less than a minute, all 3 men were face down on the pavement with their hands restrained. The late afternoon sun reflected off the black car still waiting at the curb. Kieran stood motionless for a moment, staring at it. 4 steps. That was all that had separated him from the door. 4 steps from sitting on top of a bomb. His gaze shifted slowly toward Belle. She was kneeling now, pulling Willa close against her chest. The little girl had finally begun crying again, the adrenaline draining away. Belle whispered softly to her, brushing her hair back. "It's all right. It's all right." The words trembled slightly. Because now that the danger was visible, the fear had finally caught up with her. Police sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Beckett approached Kieran. "The bomb squad's on the way," he said. Kieran nodded once. His eyes returned to Belle and Willa. For months he had walked past them every evening without seeing them. They had been part of the background of his life. Invisible. Now the entire course of his future had changed because of them. He walked slowly toward them. Belle looked up as his shadow fell across the sidewalk. For a moment neither of them spoke. Kieran lowered himself down until he was sitting on the curb beside them. His $1,000 suit pressed against the dusty pavement. A strange silence surrounded the 3 of them. Finally, he spoke. "What's your name?" Belle looked at him for a moment before answering. Her arms were still wrapped around Willa, who clung to her as if letting go might make the world fall apart again. "Belle," she said quietly. "Belle Lawson." Her voice carried the tired honesty of someone who had nothing left to pretend. Kieran nodded slowly, absorbing the name. "And this is Willa," Belle added softly, brushing her daughter's hair back from her face. The little girl lifted her head slightly from her mother's shoulder. Her blue eyes were still wet, lashes clumped together with tears, but curiosity had already begun to replace fear. Children moved on faster than adults did. Willa studied Kieran's face the way children often studied strangers, without judgment, only wonder. "Are you okay?" she asked him. Her voice was small and scratchy from crying. For a moment Kieran didn't answer. 36 years of life had placed him in rooms filled with powerful men, wealthy investors, politicians, and rivals who spoke carefully measured words. Not one of them had ever asked him that question. "Are you okay?" Yet here it was. coming from a 5-year-old girl sitting on a sidewalk, clutching a crushed rose in her hand. Kieran exhaled slowly. "I'm okay," he said quietly. His gaze shifted toward Belle. "Because of your mother." Belle lowered her eyes slightly. Sirens were growing louder now. Police cars and emergency vehicles began to fill the street around the Mercer Grand. Officers moved quickly to secure the area, pushing back the gathering crowd. A bomb squad truck pulled up minutes later. Men in protective gear moved toward the black car with careful, measured steps. The entire block fell into a tense silence. Kieran remained seated on the curb. He didn't move when the police approached him for statements. He simply gestured toward Beckett to handle the questions. His attention stayed on Belle and Willa. Belle had begun to tremble. Not from fear anymore. From the sudden release of it. Her body had carried tension for the past 20 minutes, and now that the danger was over, the adrenaline was draining away. Kieran noticed. "You're shaking," he said quietly. Belle tried to smile. "I'm fine." But the words weren't convincing. Willa shifted slightly and wrapped her small arms around her mother's neck. Belle pressed her cheek gently against the child's hair. "I'm fine," she repeated more softly. The bomb squad commander approached Kieran a short time later. "We found the device under the rear seat," he said calmly. "Remote detonation. Powerful enough to destroy the vehicle and anything within several feet." His eyes flicked briefly toward the little girl sitting in Belle's lap. He didn't finish the rest of that thought. Kieran nodded once. "Disarm it." The commander gave a quick nod and returned to his team. Belle felt another shiver run through her. If she had stayed silent. If she had taken Willa home. She didn't allow the thought to finish. Kieran looked at her again. "You understood them because your mother was Italian," he said. Belle nodded. "She taught me when I was little." A small smile touched her lips briefly. She used to say language was a bridge between worlds. Kieran considered that quietly. Across the street, Jericho and the other 2 men were being loaded into police vehicles. Their expensive plan had collapsed in less than 10 minutes. Kieran watched them go with an expression that revealed nothing. Then he looked back at Belle. "You heard a plan to kill me," he said slowly. "And you stayed." Belle hesitated. "You tried to warn my driver. You tried to go inside the hotel. You were pushed out. And you still stood here waiting for me." He studied her carefully. "Why?" The question lingered between them. Belle glanced down at Willa. The little girl had begun tracing the crushed rose petals with her finger. For a moment Belle didn't answer. Then she spoke quietly. "My mother used to say something," she said. Kieran waited. "That when you see something wrong and stay silent, you become part of it." Her voice was steady, but soft. "I didn't want my daughter growing up watching her mother turn away when she knew someone was about to get hurt." The words hung in the air. Kieran felt something shift inside him again. He had built his entire life around control, power, and calculation. But this woman had risked everything for a stranger simply because she believed it was the right thing to do. Belle continued gently. "She saw me get pushed out of the lobby earlier." Her eyes flickered with quiet pain. She was scared. Willa leaned closer against her. Belle brushed her hair again. "I almost left," Belle admitted softly. "But if I walked away, what would that teach her?" Kieran didn't answer immediately. He simply watched the 2 of them. Finally, he stood. "Come with me," he said. Belle looked up, confused. "Where?" "You shouldn't be sitting on the sidewalk right now." He gestured toward the hotel. Belle hesitated. The Mercer Grand felt like another universe compared to the life she and Willa lived. "I don't belong in there," she said quietly. Kieran gave a faint, almost invisible smile. You belong wherever you decide to stand. For a moment Belle didn't move. Then Willa tugged gently on her sleeve. Mommy, I'm tired. Belle sighed softly and lifted the little girl into her arms again. Kieran turned toward the hotel entrance. Beckett watched silently as the three of them approached the doors. He had worked for Kieran for nearly 10 years. In that time he had seen his employer negotiate billion-dollar deals without blinking. He had seen him face rivals, threats, investigations. But he had never seen Kieran Ashford sit on a curb beside a flower seller. Never seen him look at anyone the way he had looked at that little girl. As the revolving doors opened again, Beckett quietly fell into step behind them. Inside the Mercer Grand lobby, the marble floor gleamed beneath the chandeliers. Belle paused just inside the entrance. Her worn shoes felt painfully out of place against the polished surface. But Kieran kept walking. He led them toward the elevators. And for the first time since she had begun selling flowers on that corner 4 months ago, Belle Lawson stepped fully into Kieran Ashford's world. She had no idea yet that this moment would change both of their lives forever. Belle followed Kieran across the marble lobby with Willa asleep against her shoulder. The little girl had given in to exhaustion halfway through the walk. Her head rested on Belle's collarbone, her small fingers still loosely holding the crushed rose. The elevator doors opened with a quiet chime. Inside, everything felt too polished, too quiet. Belle had spent the last few years in places where walls were thin and floors creaked. This space felt like another world entirely. Kieran pressed the button for the top floor. For a moment none of them spoke. Belle watched the numbers rise slowly above the door while the weight of the evening finally settled in her chest. Her life that morning had been simple. Sell roses. Buy dinner. Put Willa to bed. Now she was riding an elevator beside one of the most powerful men in the city, after stopping someone from murdering him. The doors opened again into a quiet hallway lined with soft lights. Kieran led them into a large penthouse suite overlooking the city. Glass walls stretched from floor to ceiling. The skyline glittered beneath the fading evening light. Belle stepped inside carefully, almost afraid to breathe. Kieran turned toward her. "You can sit there," he said gently, pointing to the couch. Belle lowered Willa onto the cushions. The little girl barely stirred, curling instinctively against the soft fabric. For a moment Belle just stood beside her daughter, watching her sleep. Her fingers brushed the tangled strands of blonde hair from Willa's face. Kieran noticed the tenderness in the small movement. He walked slowly toward the window, giving Belle space. The city stretched below them like a living ocean of lights. Finally he spoke. Jericho confessed. Belle looked up. Kieran's reflection stared back from the glass. "He was paid by a rival group," he said quietly. $700,000. Belle felt a chill move through her. "And the others?" "Already in custody." His voice carried no triumph, just calm certainty. Justice had begun its work. Belle lowered herself onto the couch beside Willa. For the first time since the chaos outside the hotel, the quiet allowed her thoughts to settle. "You almost died today," she said softly. Kieran nodded. "Yes." There was no drama in the word, just truth. Belle studied him for a moment. "You're not angry with them?" she asked. Kieran turned slightly toward her. "I will deal with them." The words were simple, but Belle sensed something deeper behind them. He wasn't a man who forgot betrayal. Silence filled the room again. Then Kieran looked at Willa. The small girl shifted slightly in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. A faint smile touched his face. "She's brave," he said. Belle nodded. "She gets that from my mother." Another pause passed. Then Kieran walked over and sat in a chair across from Belle. "Your life isn't easy," he said. It wasn't a question. Belle gave a small, tired smile. No one buys many roses these days. Kieran studied her carefully. You saved my life, he said. That changes things. Belle shook her head immediately. I didn't do it for that. I know. He leaned forward slightly. But that doesn't mean it doesn't matter. Belle hesitated. Years of hardship had taught her to be cautious around powerful men and promises that sounded too generous. I don't need anything, she said quietly. Kieran's expression softened. I didn't say you did. He looked again at Willa. She asked if I was okay, he said slowly. Belle followed his gaze. Yes. Kieran's voice lowered slightly. No one has ever asked me that before. The room grew quiet again. Belle realized then that behind the expensive suit and the reputation of power, there was a loneliness she hadn't noticed before. The kind of loneliness money could never fix. You saved me, Kieran said. Then he shook his head slightly. No, that's not right. Belle looked at him. Kieran's eyes rested gently on Willa. You reminded me that someone's life can change because a stranger chooses to care. Belle felt emotion tighten her throat. Kieran stood and walked slowly to the couch. Carefully, he placed the rose that had fallen from Willa's hand onto the small table beside her. Then he looked back at Belle. There are a lot of people in this city, he said quietly. People with power. People with money. He paused. But today the bravest person on that street was a woman selling $3 roses. Belle lowered her eyes, embarrassed by the praise. I was just doing what my mother taught me. Kieran nodded. And that lesson saved my life. Outside the windows, the city lights shimmered like stars. Time seemed to slow inside the room. Belle realized something in that moment. The distance between rich and poor wasn't always measured in money. Sometimes it was measured in courage. She looked at her sleeping daughter. Maybe one day, Belle said softly, she'll remember today and understand why I couldn't stay silent. Kieran answered gently. She already does. Belle lifted her eyes. Kieran's gaze was steady and sincere. Because courage is something children recognize before adults do. For a long moment they simply sat there, watching Willa sleep peacefully between them. The chaos of the evening had passed. Justice had begun. And something unexpected had been born from a moment on a city sidewalk. Not power, not wealth, but respect. Then Kieran spoke one final time. You know, he said quietly, today proved something important. Belle looked at him. He nodded toward the basket of roses sitting beside the couch. The world often walks past the people who matter most. He paused. But sometimes, the person everyone overlooks becomes the one who saves us all. Belle felt tears rise in her eyes. Not from sadness, but from the quiet truth of the moment. Because in the end, it wasn't wealth, status, or power that had changed the course of that day. It was a mother's courage and a little girl's love. And sometimes that is all the world needs. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing for more stories like this, and tell us in the comments which region you're watching from.